At 11:59 p.m. on January 1st, 1971, a cigarette commercial for Virginia Slims aired during The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. It was the last one. A federal law had been signed 9 months earlier, and it gave the tobacco industry exactly until midnight to get off American television forever. Advertisers who had spent the entire holiday season buying up bowl game airtime for one final push watched their commercials vanish in real time. Camel, Winston, Marlboro, Kent. Every brand that had built the modern advertising industry on the back of the American smoker was gone before the ball dropped on a new decade that had barely started. That single moment is the most famous ad ban in American history. It is also just the opening scene, because the 1970s did not stop at cigarettes. Over the next 9 years, the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, and a new generation of consumer and civil rights advocates went after breakfast cereal, mouthwash, bread, beer, pantyhose, toy commercials, and mascots that had been running for a decade or more without anyone in Washington raising a hand. Some of it was federal law. Some of it was regulatory pressure. Some of it was public backlash so loud that companies pulled their own commercials rather than face a Senate hearing. Today, I'm counting down 25 commercials that aired on American television during the 1970s that could not run today, not because the jokes got old, but because the government, the courts, or the sheer weight of public pressure made sure they never ran again. Some of these you'll remember word for word, jingle and all. A few of them are going to genuinely surprise you because they weren't killed by a single dramatic hearing. They were worn down over years. One FTC complaint or one advocacy campaign at a time, until the company running them decided the fight wasn't worth it anymore. One quick rule before we start. Every entry on this list aired at some point between 1970 and 1979. Some were killed by outright federal law. Some were forced off the air by the FTC or the FCC. Some were pulled voluntarily after public pressure got loud enough that no company wanted to be the next headline. I'll tell you exactly which one it was for each entry, so you can start to see just how many different ways American television lost its most controversial commercials in a single decade. Before we get into it, if commercials like these are the reason you remember Saturday mornings a certain way, hit subscribe. This channel breaks down the ads, the mascots, and the products that television spent the last 50 years trying to make you forget. New video every couple of days. Let's get into the list. 25. The Winston cigarette cartoon tie-ins. Long before the ban, R.J. Reynolds had cigarette brands sponsoring children's programming and running spots that leaned on cartoon-adjacent imagery to soften the product for a mass audience. The strategy worked exactly as intended. Pairing a brand with characters kids already trusted made the product feel harmless, even friendly. Those campaigns were still airing in heavy rotation as the decade opened, right alongside Saturday morning lineups, often bought as a package deal with the same programming blocks that ran toy and cereal ads. When the federal cigarette ban hit in January 1971, it didn't matter how long a campaign had been running or how beloved the imagery was. Every reel of it was pulled from the schedule in a single week and never legally aired on American broadcast television again. Stations that had built entire sponsorship packages around the format had to rebuild their ad inventory from scratch, almost overnight. 24. The More Doctors cigarette endorsement format. For decades, tobacco companies ran ads featuring actors in white coats claiming doctors personally preferred their brand over the competition. It was one of the most effective advertising formats of the mid-century era. Nothing sold trust to a skeptical customer faster than a man in a lab coat vouching for the product, and it survived in various forms into the early 1970s, even as the scientific consensus on smoking had already turned decisively against it. Once the FTC began scrutinizing health-adjacent claims across the entire tobacco category, the doctor endorsement format became impossible to run credibly, and the cigarette ban erased what was left of it. The men in lab coats never came back to sell cigarettes again, and the format itself became so toxic that even legitimate health product advertisers spent years avoiding anything that looked like it. 23. Low-tar health positioning cigarette spots. As cigarette brands searched for an angle that would survive mounting health concerns, several ran ads in 1970 and early 1971 that implied switching to a lower tar brand was a genuine health improvement. The FTC treated these as implicit health claims the companies could not substantiate and pressured several campaigns off the air even before the broadcast ban made the entire debate irrelevant. The pattern the FTC used to dismantle these ads became the template regulators would reach for again and again over the rest of the decade. 22. Geritol's "My Wife, I Think I'll Keep Her." Geritol's iron supplement ads ran a husband praising his tired-looking wife with a line that made the brand a household name, implying the supplement was responsible for her renewed energy. In 1965, the FTC ordered Geritol's manufacturer to stop falsely representing that tiredness, low energy, and irritability were signs of an iron deficiency that Geritol could fix, and to affirmatively state that most cases of fatigue had nothing to do with iron at all. That order followed the company into the 1970s, restricting how the wildly popular slogan could keep running, and it became one of the earliest examples of the FTC forcing a company to contradict its own advertising on air, a remedy regulators would use far more aggressively before the decade was out. The line itself, "My wife, I think I'll keep her," outlived the ad by years, repeated as a half-joking catchphrase by American husbands well into the 1980s, long after the commercial that coined it had effectively been neutered by federal order. 21. Wonder Bread's "Build Strong Bodies 12 Ways." Wonder Bread's slogan was everywhere on lunchboxes, in cafeterias, on the bag itself, built around the idea that its added vitamins gave the bread unique nutritional power. In 1971, Ralph Nader testified before the FTC that Wonder's nutritional claims amounted to false advertising, and the FTC agreed, ruling against the company in 1973. The problem wasn't that the bread lacked those nutrients. It was that virtually every enriched bread on the market had the same fortification, a legal requirement dating back to a wartime government program, which made the 12 ways framing deceptive rather than special. Nader's testimony framed it as a case study in how a legally accurate ingredient list could still be used to build a completely misleading brand identity. One of the most recognized slogans in American advertising history was retired, and the brand never rebuilt the same cultural foothold, even though older Americans can still recite the jingle on command decades later. 20. Listerine's cold and sore throat claims. For more than 50 years, Listerine advertised that gargling with it could prevent colds and ease sore throats, a claim baked into the brand's identity since the 1920s. In 1975, the FTC ordered Warner Lambert not only to stop making the claim, but to spend roughly $10 million about a year's advertising budget running ads that explicitly stated Listerine would not help prevent colds or sore throats or lessen their severity. The company was told to spend its next round of advertising literally correcting the claim consumers had been hearing for decades. It was the first time in American regulatory history that a company was forced to spend its own ad budget undoing its own marketing, and the case became the foundation for every corrective advertising order that followed. Warner Lambert fought the ruling all the way through the appeals courts, arguing the FTC had no authority to compel that kind of forced self-correction. But the order was upheld, and the corrective campaign ran through 1978, telling millions of viewers the exact opposite of what 50 years of Listerine advertising had trained them to believe. 19. Profile Bread's weight loss positioning. Profile Bread ran a campaign claiming the product could help people lose weight, built entirely around the fact that its slices were cut thinner than a standard loaf, meaning each individual slice carried fewer calories. Regulators viewed this as a deceptive framing, since the bread itself wasn't lower in calories by weight, only by how thin the company chose to slice it. The ads were forced off the air in the early 1970s, and the case became an early blueprint for how the FTC would evaluate nutrition-adjacent marketing tricks for the rest of the decade. 18. The Frito Bandito. The Frito Bandito was a sombrero-wearing, gun-toting cartoon mascot who robbed people of their corn chips, voiced by Mel Blanc and animated by Tex Avery. Advocacy groups, including the National Mexican-American Anti-Defamation Committee, found the campaign racist, and after RFK's assassination in 1968, Frito-Lay quietly removed the character's gun and gold tooth in an attempt to soften him. It wasn't enough. By January 1971, The NMAADC and allied groups had moved toward a $610 million lawsuit against Frito-Lay for the defamation of Mexican Americans, and Frito-Lay officially discontinued the Frito Bandito that same year. Frito-Lay actually pushed back hard before finally caving, citing its own survey claiming the majority of Mexican American respondents had no problem with the character. The advocacy groups didn't back down, and neither did the growing number of television stations quietly declining to run the spots. It remains one of the clearest cases of public advocacy, forcing a mascot off American television entirely on its own, without a single federal regulation being written, a company folding under cultural pressure alone. Years before, boycott was a word advertisers worried about the way they do now. 17. Aunt Jemima's original kerchief-era ads. Throughout the early 1970s, Aunt Jemima commercials still leaned on plantation-era imagery that had defined the character since the 19th century. Growing criticism from civil rights organizations pushed Quaker Oats to quietly retire the most dated versions of these spots well before the character herself was formally redesigned in 1989 and retired completely in 2020. The 1970s versions, the ones with the original kerchief and apron styling running in heavy rotation, have not aired in their original form in decades, and they represent one of the clearest examples of a campaign that regulators never touched, but that cultural pressure alone made unbroadcastable. 16. The Hot Wheels half-hour cartoon. In 1969, Mattel financed a Saturday morning cartoon built entirely around its Hot Wheels toy line, and it kept airing into the following year. A rival toy manufacturer complained to the FCC that the cartoon was, in reality, a 30-minute commercial for Mattel's miniature racing cars, and the FCC agreed that the show's content contained commercial material and required the network to log it accordingly. It wasn't a formal ban, but it effectively ended the show's run and created something bigger, the FCC's first working definition of a program-length commercial, a concept that reshaped what could air on Saturday mornings for the next 2 decades. Every toy-based cartoon that followed had to be built around that ruling, which is why, decades later, media historians still point to a cartoon about tiny orange racetracks as the moment the government first drew a legal line between entertainment and advertising for children. 15. Vitamin supplement ads. Aimed at children, newly formed advocacy group Action for Children's Television petitioned the FCC in 1970 to sharply restrict advertising during kids' programming, specifically targeting vitamin makers who ran ads, encouraging children to want chewable vitamins the way they wanted candy. Vitamin makers voluntarily withdrew their advertising from children's programming rather than fight the growing regulatory and public pressure, making it one of the first categories to disappear from Saturday mornings without ever needing a formal FCC order. 14. Chevron's F310 gasoline additive campaign. Chevron ran a heavy rotation of ads in the early 1970s claiming its F310 gasoline additive dramatically reduced smog-causing exhaust, complete with dramatic before and after demonstrations. Independent researchers and regulators challenged the science behind the demonstrations, arguing the ads overstated the additive's real-world impact on emissions. The campaign drew formal scrutiny and was eventually pulled and reworked, becoming one of the earliest test cases for how the FTC would treat environmental and performance claims in an era when the 1973 OPEC oil embargo was about to make gasoline advertising a political minefield anyway. 13. Coppertone's deep tan marketing. Coppertone spent the 1970s selling the golden, deeply tanned look as the goal of every summer, with campaigns actively encouraging extended sun exposure. As dermatology, research through the decade increasingly connected prolonged tanning to skin damage, the most aggressive tan encouragement messaging was phased out by the end of the 1970s in favor of softer positioning. The brand's most famous image, a puppy tugging at a toddler's bathing suit to reveal a tan line, became a symbol of an entirely different pre-regulation era of sun care marketing that companies have spent decades walking back. What had once been an innocent, sun-drenched piece of Americana slowly turned into the exact kind of imagery that modern advertising standards would never let near a children's product again. We're past the halfway point, and by now the pattern should be obvious. Almost none of these commercials disappeared the moment they became a problem. Most of them ran for years, sometimes over a decade, while complaints piled up quietly in the background. It took a lawsuit, a nadir testimony, or a wave of public pressure to actually get them pulled. And real quick, if you were watching television during any of this, if you remember the jingles before you remember why they vanished, that's exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe now, because there's a new one of these every couple of days, and we're just getting to the entries that really shook the ad industry. 12. Joe Namath's Beauty Mist Pantyhose ad. In 1974, Hanes ran a commercial for its Beauty Mist Pantyhose line, featuring football star Joe Namath sliding the hosiery onto his own legs, with the tagline built around the idea that if pantyhose could make his legs look good, they'd work for anyone. It was one of the most talked-about commercials of the decade, genuinely transgressive for its era, and several local affiliates refused to run it outright. It wasn't formally banned by any federal agency, but the wave of station-level refusals and network pressure pulled it from national rotation within weeks, establishing an informal but powerful precedent. Local broadcast standards could kill a national campaign just as effectively as a federal order. 11. The Marlboro Man's Final TV Run. By 1970, the Marlboro Man was arguably the single most recognizable advertising figure in the country, having anchored the brand's television presence since 1954. When the broadcast cigarette ban took effect in January 1971, the character's television career ended in an instant, even as he continued riding across billboards and magazine pages for nearly 3 more decades. The most successful advertising campaign in American history was still growing when the government simply switched off the only screen it had ever needed. Print and billboard versions of the campaign would go on to run for decades more, eventually becoming one of the most studied case studies in advertising history. But the character viewers actually grew up watching between programs. The one who rode across their living rooms every night was gone for good in a single legislative stroke. 10. Camel's long-running jingle campaigns. Camel's decades-old advertising, including its famous walking jingle, was still airing in the years leading up to the ban, layered across daytime and primetime programming alike. The cigarette ban didn't discriminate between old campaigns and new ones. Camel's advertising, some of it older than the television medium itself, vanished from American screens on the same night as every other tobacco brand in the country. 9. Annison's Fast Relief. Nervous tension. Claims. Annison's ads for years combined imagery suggesting the pain reliever worked faster than competitors and could ease vague, nervous tension. Claims the company struggled to substantiate when regulators started asking for evidence. Federal Trade Commission scrutiny throughout the 1970s targeted exactly this kind of speed and tension positioning across the over-the-counter pain reliever category, and Annison's parent company faced repeated challenges to relaunch the same basic promise in slightly different packaging. Each attempt drew fresh regulatory pushback, and by the end of the decade, the aggressive tension relief angle that had defined the brand for years had been substantially dismantled. What had once been a marketing shortcut, promise speed, promise stress relief, skipped the actual clinical evidence, became one of the clearest examples in the whole decade of the FTC treating repackaged deception as seriously as the original claim. 8. The Schaefer Beer More Than One campaign. Schaefer's slogan, "The One Beer To," have when you're having more than one built an entire ad identity around continuous drinking, showing working-class men steadily working through round after round at social gatherings. As alcohol awareness advocacy groups gained cultural traction in the mid-1970s, the imagery of endless consumption became a liability, and the company quietly reworked the campaign, dropping the visuals of nonstop drinking well before the decade closed. The slogan lived on in print for a while longer, fading out as the broader conversation around alcohol marketing shifted underneath it. 7. Calgon's Ancient Chinese Secret. Add Calgon's water softener commercial, in which a customer asks a laundress how she gets clothes so clean, and receives the reply, "Ancient Chinese Secret," became one of the most repeated lines of the decade. As Asian American advocacy groups increasingly pushed back against the stereotype embedded in the punchline throughout the later 1970s, Calgon retired the spot rather than continue defending it. The phrase stuck around in American slang for years afterward, but the commercial itself hasn't aired in its original form since. 6. Toyota's "You Asked for It, You Got It" performance ads. Toyota's aggressive 1970s campaign leaned hard into speed, acceleration, and performance messaging, riding the same energy as most automotive advertising of the era. That entire approach became politically untenable almost overnight after the 1973 OPEC oil embargo turned fuel economy into a national obsession. Automakers, Toyota included, voluntarily walked back performance-focused campaigns industry-wide, and by 1978, Toyota's original spots had been quietly replaced with ads built around reliability and gas mileage instead. It wasn't a government ban. It was an entire advertising category deciding, almost simultaneously, that its old pitch no longer worked in the country it was selling to. 5. Ovaltine's "You'll Feel Stronger Fast" ads. Ovaltine had spent decades promising that drinking the chocolate malt beverage would make children stronger and healthier, a claim baked into the brand's identity since the 1930s. As the FTC widened its scrutiny of nutrition-adjacent advertising across the food and beverage industry through the early to mid-1970s, strength and growth claims like Ovaltine's became increasingly difficult to keep running without hard evidence behind them, and the most explicit versions of the pitch were phased out well before 1980. The product survived. The specific promise that built the brand did not. 4. The Sugar Cereal Saturday Morning ad blocks. Saturday morning programming through most of the 1970s was saturated with sugary cereal advertising, dense blocks of commercials for heavily sweetened brands running back to back, aimed directly at children too young to distinguish advertising from the cartoon around it. In 1978, the FTC published a staff report calling for a complete ban on advertising aimed at children too young to understand its persuasive intent, specifically proposing to ban TV marketing to children under 8 and restrict junk food marketing to children under 12. Food and advertising industries responded by spending an unprecedented amount of money fighting the proposal, and Congress ultimately passed the FTC Improvement Act of 1980, explicitly stripping the FTC of the authority to regulate children's advertising on the grounds the agency had used. The rule died, but cereal companies still cut sugar content and toned down their pitches, and ABC cut back its Saturday morning commercial load proof that even a failed federal proposal permanently changed what companies were willing to put on air. Congress's own decision to defang the agency became, in its own way, one of the most consequential moments in the entire history of advertising regulation, because it drew a line the FTC has never fully been allowed to cross again, even as childhood nutrition concerns only grew louder in the decades that followed. 3. War-themed toy commercials. As toy advertising grew more elaborate through the back half of the decade, some campaigns pushed into genuinely intense territory, children reenacting combat scenarios in ads packed with explosion effects and battle sound design, running during prime Saturday morning viewing hours. The reaction from parents' groups and child psychologists was immediate, feeding directly into the broader children's advertising backlash that produced the FTC's 1978 proposal. The specific proposal to ban all such advertising outright never survived Congress, but the toy industry, wary of the fight the cereal companies had just been through, voluntarily tightened its own standards around war-themed toy advertising, rather than risk another regulatory fight it might not win. 2. McDonald's Bicentennial Children's Marketing Push. McDonald's ran a massive campaign tied to the 1976 American Bicentennial, wrapping patriotic imagery and historical reenactments around the familiar "You Deserve a Break Today" slogan, while leaning heavily into Happy Meal-style promotions aimed squarely at children. The campaign itself wasn't banned, but the business model it represented, particularly the direct targeting of young children with toy-driven meal promotions, became one of the central examples cited in the FTC's 1978 push to restrict children's advertising altogether. The bicentennial spots ran their course and were retired within a year. The marketing structure underneath them, the one regulators tried and failed to dismantle, is still exactly how fast food sells to kids today. 1. The full federal cigarette advertising ban. Everything else on this list is a company pulling one campaign, or a regulator forcing one correction. This is different. The Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act, signed by President Nixon on April 1, 1970, banned every cigarette advertisement from American radio and television, taking effect January 2, 1971. After a deliberate compromise, let broadcasters run cigarette ads through the New Year's Day college football bowl games one final time. The very last cigarette commercial in American television history, for Virginia Slims, aired at 11:59 p.m. Eastern on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, and then it was over. Every brand, every jingle, every decades-old campaign, gone in the same instant. The ban hit network advertising revenue hard enough that some stations reported losses of up to 50%, and the largest single advertising category in the country simply ceased to exist overnight. Nothing else on this list comes close to that scale, and nothing like it has happened to any product category since. So that's the list 25 commercials that defined the 1970s, and then, one way or another, got erased from it. What's striking watching it all together isn't any single ad. It's the pattern. This was the one decade where consumer advocacy, civil rights organizing, and federal regulators were all pulling in the same direction at the same time, and American advertising simply could not survive contact with all three at once. It never fully happened again. By the early 1980s, deregulation had gutted the FTC's authority to touch children's advertising, and the free fire zone era of the 1960s and early 70s that regulators spent 9 years dismantling never really returned. But it also never got the chance to fully come back either. If you made it this far, you clearly remember what Saturday mornings and primetime commercial breaks actually looked like before all of this. You remember the jingles, the mascots, the exact cadence of a voiceover promising something no regulator would ever let a company say out loud today. That's exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and I'll see you in the next one, where we go through the cigarette ads that specifically targeted kids, the ones that ran for years before anyone in Washington connected the dots and the decade-long fight it took to finally get them off the air for good.